you a little bit about the themes that we address in the exhibition, so we can see Antonio's work and the incredible breadth and scope of it. But I wanted to start with this image because it illustrates the idea that we were very interested in underscoring, which is that Antonio, as a signature, is really a symbol for two people working very closely together, Antonio Lopez and his partner, Juan Ramos. Antonio and Juan met here at FIT when they were both students here, but they were both born in Puerto Rico, born on the island, and then came to New York both very young. They were raised here in New York. Antonio was raised in East Harlem, and they met when they were both studying here. And so one of the things that we wanted to illustrate is that, you know, while Antonio did the drawing, Juan often mixed the paints for Antonio to use in his paintings. And Juan also was sort of the idea or the creative director. You know, a commission would come in to do something like an ad for Bloomingdale's for fall 1968 or whatever, and they would get inspiration from books that Juan would go out and buy. That was his job, to sort of go out to Rizzoli's bookstore and find big books from the history of art to be inspired for new projects. And so he was really an important figure. So we start with a wall that shows a little bit about the early years. And I always like to start with this Andy Warhol portrait of Antonio Lopez. There's two almost identical portraits that Andy Warhol made of Antonio. This is late, this is around 1983. There's also a black and white version, which is now in private collection. But this full color collection remains in the estate of Antonio and Juan. And we start on the left-hand side with these amazing drawings that he did early on for the New York Times fashion magazine, 1962, 1963. And you can see how, from the beginning, he was really interested in looking at the history of art. He was, in a way, like Picasso. People talk about him being a trier-on of styles. If you look at Picasso's work, he's imitating different kinds of styles throughout his career. Antonio did the same thing, where he looked at the history of art and at key figures. So in this case, he's looking at the French Cubist painter, Fernand Léger, and the kind of painting he was doing in the 20s and 30s, and imitating the style of Léger, but focusing on the clothing that the models are wearing. And then also, the reason we put this at the very entrance of the exhibition is that you see from the beginning with these images that make allusions to Native American culture, that he was interested from the beginning in broadening the scope of the fashion industry, especially in terms of looking at what was beautiful and looking at people of color, especially for inspiration. The portrait of Warhol came about because they were actually very close friends, and Andy Warhol asked Antonio to become the illustrator for his Interview magazine, which he started in the early 1970s. And so Antonio did many, many illustrations for Interview. And at the end, I'll show you a special issue of Interview magazine that he worked on in Puerto Rico, interviewing some of the most important stars in Puerto Rican culture at the time. Here's a close-up of these two images. You can see, again, the hairstyle and the way that the model is posed, and even this scene that you see that's kind of surreal. You can't really tell where she's standing, right? This is very typical of Léger's work. And then again, bringing in Native American culture into fashion was something that he was interested in from the very beginning. Here you can see directly these three paintings on the right-hand side are by Fernand Léger, so you can see where he's drawing inspiration from. He's looking at many different periods of art history. He was interested in Goya, and all of these approaches become evident in his work. This is also at the entrance to the show because I think in a nutshell, it illustrates how Juan and Antonio worked together, and it illustrates the ideas that were important to them that you don't think of always when you think about fashion or fashion illustration. So what you see is a perfect marriage of Antonio's drawing and Juan Ramos's photographs. Juan took a series of black and white photographs in the fashion district, but it was the men who were working in the fashion district. So it's the people who were loading and unloading the trucks, moving the racks of clothing, working hard, and he took these black and white photographs. There's a series of several of them, and these became the backdrop for Antonio's drawings. And this was a technique they used quite a bit. There was a set of illustrations that they did for Elle magazine in the mid-1960s that were never published because they sent a series of drawings that were laid over photographs of the race riots, the civil rights movement race riots in Selma, Alabama. And the magazine felt that this was not appropriate as a background for fashion in their pages, so they ended up not using these images. which made Antonio and Juan learn that the way to get your art published exactly the way you wanted to was to turn it in late. Turn it in at the last minute, the book would have to go to publication, and your image would be reproduced as you wanted to rather than censored. But what I think is important about this is not only that it's Juan's photography and Antonio's drawings at the top of it, but the fact that they were always from the beginning interested in social issues. This is an early piece from 1962 or 63, and this is something that they would maintain an interest in throughout their careers. So we have a setup in the exhibition in the opening gallery where you see a number of photographs of the two of them together. They loved fashion, they loved clothes, and they would often get dressed up every night. Dancing was a big part of their daily lives. They would go to the New York clubs, they would go to the clubs in Paris when they lived there too. And so getting dressed up to go out was an important part of the daily ritual. So we have a lot of really beautiful photographs of them. And then these two drawings, both by Antonio, one is a self-portrait, and the other is his portrait of Juan Ramos. We also were lucky to get a couple of examples of his yearbooks. He went to the high school for art and design first before coming to FIT, so we have examples of each of those. And this was really exciting because it showed his East Harlem address, which is, since the museum is based in East Harlem, it was even more amazing to us to have someone who was from the neighborhood, who becomes such an important, iconic figure in the New York fashion world, return to El Barrio from the museum. Also, throughout the exhibition, we have 3 examples of his journals. He kept amazing, meticulous journals where he listed everything that he spent all day long. If he took a cab to the New York Times to drop off drawings, $1.35. If he went to have lunch at the Carnegie Deli and he invited a bunch of friends, $5. So he would list everything that he did all day long. And it was a really great way to live through his life with these incredible details. So this is a set of drawings. A lot of the work in this exhibition has never been illustrated, never been published before. It's never been shown before. We had to frame a lot, I would say 3/4 of the things that are in the show. And then the other 1/4 are things that are not framed because they're photographs or ephemeral works that are in vitrines. But this is a really nice example of work that you've never seen before. It's never been published, but it shows very early on, again, 63, 64, his interest in the woman of color, specifically the body of color, and how these can be integrated into fashion illustration. We were also interested in his depiction of the male body, and so this opens up the section that's really looking at that. And I love these series of photographs on the right-hand side because, again, to me, they prove that he returned to East Harlem frequently for inspiration. These are some kids that were maybe playing basketball in a park in East Harlem, and he stopped and asked if he could take their photographs. He loved using regular people instead of models. And photography is really interesting, the way he uses it almost as a snapshot in the moment, but then as a fine artwork in the end when he puts it together in a grid like this. One of the things he talks about, one of really the most important things that I was able to access through, thanks to FIT, was the lectures that Antonio Juan came back to give to the students. They were invited 2 or 3 times to come back to FIT and talk about their work. And one of the students during one of these lectures asked Antonio why he was fracturing the body. He had seen illustrations in a magazine that showed these sort of partial or bisected bodies that were incomplete. And he said he was interested in studying the anatomy of the body in a simplified way, but also sort of looking at those interstices between the arm and the leg and the torso, because he felt it was helping him study the body in a different way. And he wasn't sure yet where it was leading, but he was interested and feeling like it was sending him in a new direction. And so what you see here is Antonio doing the lines, but maybe Juan has mixed the colors the night before, knowing that he's going to be working on a series of things for the next day. And typically he would, for just one campaign, for example, this is a series of drawings that he did for Versace, he would do many, many drawings to get to the final drawing that he turned in. And so we wanted to illustrate that. So we put together, again, these had never been shown before. We had to frame all these. There were, close to 40 of these drawings that he made for Versace. And this is the final product. So it was a series of 4 posters that he made for the store. But to get to this point, he did tons and tons of drawings. And here again, you see The female model is fully dressed, and her body is entirely represented. But the male model is nude. He's sometimes missing an arm or a leg, or in this case, the whole bottom of his body, almost like he's a sculpture. He's like an art piece that's inside the ad with the model who's wearing the Versace clothing. And I think putting them all together gave this sense that of the amount of work involved in just creating a single set of posters for the store. And so he began to experiment with these shapes of these bodies, and I think eventually he gets to this really interesting kind of silhouette form that he's studying. So he's still looking at the poses, but playing with them and playing with the history of art. So we look at something like Greek vase painting, which he would have seen when he went to the Met, and he's doing that same idea of these figures that are moving, they're athletic, they're beautiful, just the way the classical Greek painters made them, but making them in his less formal watercolor drawings. This is a fantastic work too, and I have to say that I hadn't even noticed what the model was wearing until a friend of mine who's a Chicano scholar came and immediately took a photograph of the crotch, which is the eagle that was used as a design element for the Farm Workers Union, the United Farm Workers Union. So Cesar Chavez, who's in the photograph in the upper left corner, was the leader of the farm workers movement in California, and part of the movement then was to create a graphic identity that would resonate with the people who were marching at the time and protesting agricultural worker conditions. And so that eagle becomes a really important icon, and I love the way that Antonio used it as part of the design for the costume, that this figure is wearing this sort of Native American, might be a little bit Roman also. He invented things and brought these different influences together to make this really powerful form. So they were in New York. Once they met each other at FIT, they became romantic partners first, and immediately started working together on these commissions that they got for Women's Wear Daily and for the New York Times Fashion. When he left Women's Wear Daily, it was to take his job full-time, being the fashion illustrator for the New York Times. But they were looking for more opportunities, so they decided to go to Paris. They had become friends with Karl Lagerfeld, and he invited them to have a studio in a building that his mother owned in Paris. And so they went from 69 to around 1974, and they really enjoyed Paris. In the exhibition, there's a series of beautiful black and white photographs that they took just in the studio, playing around with friends, with Karl, with Pat Cleveland. They were able to help several American models launch careers in Paris just by inviting them to come and stay with them. They did photo shoots with them, they used them in drawings, and eventually people like Grace Jones and Pat Cleveland really got their careers started by working with Antonio and Juan. Another really nice section in the exhibition shows a series of drawings that Antonio made for Karl Lagerfeld. So their relationship started early in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and they worked together for many, many years. Karl Lagerfeld designed a series of musical dresses for Chloe, and so these are some of the illustrations that Antonio did for them. We were able to borrow from Chloe a reproduction of the original violin dress, which they reissued in the 1990s. And so it's in the exhibition also next to the drawing that Antonio did. And what I love about it is that you can see in the background here, there's figures in the background of the drawing. Actually, you can see a bigger version of it here. There's these figures here, and then the musical instruments that are repeated that make you see that he really is being inspired by the Harlem Renaissance and artists who are working in the Harlem Renaissance. So these are the illustrations by an African-American artist from Kansas who came to New York to become an illustrator and an artist, Aaron Douglas. And so I think Antonio would have been aware of these kinds of images that were popular in the 1920s and 30s, and they give that vibe of the musical scene in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s. Then, as I said, they both invited friends of theirs who were models to come and stay with them in Paris, and so these became the women who were known as Antonio's girls. And this publication is out of print. It's really hard to find, but it's one of the best ones that shows the variety of Antonio and Juan's works and talks about the kind of exhibitions that they did all over the place. And so this is the drawing. This was an ad for Bloomingdale's that shows a lot of the women that were in their circle of models that they used over and over again, including Pat Cleveland, Grace Jones, Jerry Hall, who was Antonio's girlfriend before he realized he was gay, when he was, figuring it out. A Japanese woman named Sayoko, Jessica Lange, who they also met in Paris. She was a model before she came back to Hollywood and became an actress. So these people were important in Antonio's life, and they appear over and over again in his works, drawings, and photographs. So this is where I wanted to point out, it's so interesting how he uses a really inexpensively mass-produced camera, which was the Instamatic. I had an Instamatic when I was little. They produced them first in 1963, but then they had later iterations in the 1970s. And so when he bought his Instamatic, it was the kind of point-and-shoot camera that you carry with you on vacation. You're just going to take a quick snapshot. But he used it for high art. This is where I think he becomes like a conceptual artist almost. And here, there's actually 9 of these. So what he did was he would purposefully take more than what he needed, and then he would edit down to a grid of 9 or 12 photographs and use them to tell a story. And sometimes it's almost surreal. We don't really know what's happening. Here's these 2 women in a photo in a phone booth. They're sort of dressed and half undressed. So we don't know the story, but we use our imagination to fill in those details. But I think the fact that he's using this point-and-shoot camera as a work of art, as a tool for making high art, is a really interesting way of using the camera. And he did this over and over again. The camera and photography was really part and parcel of everything that he did. Oftentimes when he was working on one series of works, he would do drawing, painting, and different kinds of photographs of Polaroid and Instamatic. Here's images of him with the model Amina Warsum at the Vogue offices. You see they're always playing around with pose and gesture and body type also. This is what I think becomes so important. This was Karl Labrie was the model for the drawing on the left-hand side, and this is Pat Cleveland again on the right, channeling Josephine Baker, who was an important icon for him. So he looked to historic periods and important women from the fine arts and from entertainment to be models for the iconic women that he was drawing. And that was one of, I think, his biggest and maybe most important and most far-reaching accomplishment was to bring the body of color, especially into fashion illustration. He was always interested in Grace Jones, Amina Warsum, or Karl Labrie, these women that for him were real beauties who also happened to be of African descent. One of my favorite tropes that he uses over and over again, and there's a nice set in the collection here at FIT, is what he called his shoe metamorphosis. And so the shoe became something that he used over and over again. There's a reference in one of the lectures at FIT to a shoe book that they were doing. They wanted to publish a book about shoes, and they were hoping to do it in time for the holidays. The book was never published, but they did a lot of work towards it, including a series of small, these are tiny, they're maybe 4 by 6 inches or 5 by 7 inches, individual drawings of these fantastic, impossible to wear stilettos, but also photographs of famous women in their heels. Sometimes they would become almost like futuristic fantasy wear, or in this case, I love this. I mean, this predates the sneaker wedge that was, hot like a year or 2 ago. Now, he was doing this, 40 years ago at this point. One of the other things I think that's important and is illustrated in the exhibition is how many different ways that Antonio and Juan worked together. And so while they would do drawings as part of the ad campaign, this is a set of drawings that he did for, originally they were commissioned by GQ for 1973 or 74, and even at that time they were considered too racy, so they were never published. There was one that was published later in a gay publication in 1979, but really were never used otherwise. But the way he worked is that he would have the models come to the studio, dress them in the clothes, and then they would work in the studio together, him taking photographs, and then eventually do these quick drawings in the moment, and then these would be translated into the larger sketches that I showed you. But this is one of the important themes that we wanted to look at. The co-curator for this exhibition is a woman named Amelia Malagamba, who's a scholar of Chicano art history. But she had done some work on Antonio Lopez in the late 1990s and published a really fantastic essay in 2001, which you can still find on the Smithsonian Institution's website. And we also have it at the museum. It's part of the brochure that we give out when people come. But her essay was really important because it looked at things that go beyond the surface of the fashion illustration. So she was looking at the bodies, the gestures that they're making, how they're positioned in relationship to one another, the homoerotic element in the images. And so all of these things she really explored in this essay, and that became the focus of a lot of the themes that we were looking at in the exhibition. So I would say the male body, sexuality, and then music and dance, which we'll look at in a second, all sort of are evoked by Amelia's essay. This is another set of images that shows the way that they like to work and how actually DIY and low-tech it was. It wasn't the high-tech fashion studio that you might imagine. You know, if you wanted to have a photograph where there's ribbons, metallic ribbons tied to the model's hair, and the ribbons come out of the photograph, it would be Antonio or Juan holding up the ribbon and then taking the photograph so that that part was cropped out. But they have these great shots of them working where you can see actually how much work goes into just making one set of photographs for one project. Also, because he wanted to create these impossible to wear stiletto shoes that were almost like a sculpture, he fabricated them himself from resin and plastic and then tied ribbons to them. So a lot of these things, fabrics that were used in the photographs were things that he had collected. It was really something generated by them. This to me is the most important theme in the exhibition, and it's how important hip hop and graffiti and breakdance were for both Juan and Antonio. They left Paris in the mid-1970s and came back, and their studio, eventually they moved to Union Square. And so this is where I think they would have encountered these young dancers from the Rocksteady crew. The Rocksteady crew was founded in the early 70s in the South Bronx. And so by the mid to late 70s, breakdancing was sort of already over in the Bronx. But in Manhattan, where there was still a tourist culture, there was a lot of still burgeoning interest in dance and in graffiti and hip hop. And so there was a younger sort of subset of the Rocksteady crew that danced in Union Square regularly. And so Antonio got to know them and he would invite them back to his studio. And so you can see part of the way he liked to work is to have dancers and music working or going on at the same time while he was working. It wasn't distracting to him. To him, it was the source of his inspiration. And in fact, he says that in one of the lectures here at FIT. He brought the breakdancers with him to the lecture to have them perform, and he introduces them by saying, this is a deeply influential element of New York City culture for me. It's very influential in my work. And so I think you see that borne out, not only by, I just want to fast forward to a couple of pictures like this, where he's using the breakdancing models, you know, as drawings, but he eventually begins to incorporate them also into ads and commissions that he gets from magazines. So this was from a series of 12 watercolor drawings that he did for L'Uomo, Italian Vogue for men, and he calls them his warrior series, his urban warrior series. And what he's done is adapt some of the urban styles that the breakdancers wear, the pleated pants, the really heavy jackets, almost like armor. And then he adds these anthropological or natural history museum kind of details where there's like a hatchet or a spear that looks like it came out of a museum collection, and they become his urban warriors. And all of that comes straight from this kind of influence where these are photographs taken by his studio photographer, Matthew Olsnick, who took many, many photographs of the breakdancers as they came into the studio. And then he incorporates them into all kinds of, this is a series that he did for Missoni. So they're wearing the Missoni sweaters, but look at what they're doing with their hands and feet. You know, these are the popping moves of breakdance that if you know, you know. But if maybe you're reading a magazine and you're in Italy and you're looking at the Missoni ad, you see the sweater and it looks cool because of the way he posed the model, but you don't really know necessarily that that's a breakdance move. But this was important to him, and he thought how enriching it would be to use these kinds of elements in things like fashion illustration. I think that's what makes him kind of a genius. So this is examples of the Rocksteady crew. Fabel is on the right-hand side. He came to the opening and he saw himself in the drawings. A lot of the guys from the Rocksteady crew came. They were really excited to see. And so he used them for his drawings. They became the models. Here they are posed with the models. Everybody's popping, breakdancing. And here, this is where, this was so crucial actually, and I'm so happy that the FIT kept records of his talks. We were able to find a video of him doing a live drawing of this exact painting, and this painting was still in the collection of the estate. So it's a perfect moment where you see him in 10 minutes render this amazing portrait of the model Angelo Colon, and a model that he used a lot, all with breakdance music in the background. So when he came to FIT, he not only brought the dancers with him, he brought his DJ, and the DJ would play music while Antonio worked. So you see both happening at the same time. Angelo Colon is a really interesting figure. He was a model and an actor, and he sometimes acted as the body double for Grace Jones. Had this really, what's the word, androgynous kind of look to him. And Antonio loved his hair, his eyebrows, his cheekbones, so you see several images of him in the exhibition. So here's where you see the installation that shows the video of Antonio working with the drawing right next to it. This is a series of drawings that we were really excited when we saw them, and we were so glad that he had kept them. This is the kind of thing that has never gone into a gallery show, even though he's had gallery shows and they've sold really well. He just had one in 2013 maybe at Suzanne Guy's gallery downtown, but none of these were in that show. And these are all the Rocksteady crew dancers that Antonio drew while they were at his studio. And in some cases, some of them signed with their graffiti tag their own portrait. And in the middle is a portrait of Doze, who later he's now a really well-known artist who's done really well. And this came from the collection of Narciso Rodriguez, who's admired Antonio Lopez for a long time and had a few drawings in his collection, in his own collection. So you see how they've got their poses on, they've got their street dance clothes on, and then he writes their name, or they sign their own name, and he signs the drawing also. This is really one of my favorite parts of the show. And then because, graffiti was an important part, he actually asked the Rocksteady crew to make a backdrop for him so that he would pose his models and his friends in front of it, so the graffiti would be in the background, add a little bit of grittiness of New York to the studio. And so we thought it would be nice to invite two artists, graffiti artists, one younger and one of an older generation who knew Antonio, to collaborate on a new piece that we could add to the exhibition. And so they became inspired. They made a stencil of his signature, and then did a whole series of tags of people that they worked with. So Grayson Jones' name is in here, Pat Cleveland, all the guys from the Rocksteady crew are in here. And that sort of opens up into the next section, which looks at music. There was a series of drawings that he did of these iconic female singers. When he was in Puerto Rico, he did a series of photographs of Iris Chacon, who's on the left-hand side. This is his illustration of Diana Ross on the right-hand side. I love the Iris drawing because just using the little lines with the curves in them and the arrows, he's almost showing like the way she moves her body when she dances. And we have an entire wall that looks at musical influences and the drawings that resulted from them, because the music collection we think was really important. So there was no inventory of these albums, so Amelia and I went and sat one afternoon and went through all of these 300 some albums, inventoried all of them just to see the kind of influence that music had on Antonio and Juan's work. He always had music playing, and he loved club music, and he loved funk also. And so you see that over and over again in his collection. And he was even invited to do a couple of illustrations. These are illustrations of, this is the Jay Giles Band, this is a Rita Coolidge album that he did, and then this is the first one that he was invited to do for a group called the Frenchies. And then this was one, I was really excited to see this album in the collection. The Voices of East Harlem was a group founded in East Harlem of young people aged 14 to 22 who started out as kind of a neighborhood group. They would perform, they were singers, they would perform at local picnics and family gatherings or block parties. But eventually became so famous that they performed at Carnegie Hall and at Radio City Music Hall with some of the most important jazz performers of the time period. And if you Google them, their big hit is called Ride On and Be Free. And so I was really happy to see that Antonio had this in his collection. It's, again, proof that East Harlem remained an important inspiration to him throughout his career. And so this was the issue that I referred to earlier. They were invited, Andy Warhol asked them to do an issue just on Puerto Rico and on Puerto Rican culture. And so they went and spent an entire month in Puerto Rico doing interviews and fashion shoots and illustrations. So this is Antonio's illustration for the cover. It features Rita Moreno And there's a really fantastic video, a short film in the exhibition of her, and also Edie's check on. So it's sort of like a who's who. This is what the installation looks like that shows every single page of the magazine. And it's literally like the most important figures who are working in Puerto Rico or in New York at that time who were Puerto Rican heritage. So there's Vina Moreno, there's an interview with Chita Rivera, and then there's a whole series of these fantastic, again, these beautiful instamatic photographs that he took and then turned into a work of art. What I love that appears over and over again in these Puerto Rico photographs is the palm leaf. You know, that's probably something he missed the most after leaving Puerto Rico and coming to a cold gray winter of New York. His father came to New York first by way of Miami, and he had purchased some of these postcards that show the warm beaches of Florida. And he sent one of those postcards to the family to say, "Come join me in New York." And when they got here in January, it was a total shock for Antonio. And so you see his longing for this beautiful tropical landscape, I think, in these photographs that he creates. And again, a lot of these were just people that he encountered on the street and asked if he could just take their photograph. This is the final theme that we look at in the exhibition that we thought was really important and became evident as the mounting evidence of photographs and drawings especially that we looked through in the archives. And this was the influence of Futurism and Afrofuturism. Futurism especially is something that he seemed to be interested from very early on, as early as the 1962, 1963. He was doing images of what he called space people. But then throughout the 70s and 80s, he would do images like this of these really powerful women. They're not the typical model's body, right? These warrior-like women who also wear these insane contraptions that look somehow futuristic. And I think it's impossible to overestimate the kind of influence that something like Star Wars had. This is 1977, and just a year later, Antonio makes a fembot C3PO version, right? He just changes her into a female model instead. Here it is again. You can see where he's taken this almost like a mixing of influence of Metropolis, the movie from the 20s, and Star Wars. This is the one I was referring to. This is from 1962. He did this for the New York Times. It was part of a series he called Space People. And then throughout, you see images from the 80s and 90s that show this influence, this interest in space as a kind of utopian future. Here's a couple of other examples. This is the model Maria Snyder, and he's just piled half on top of her head and added these odd things that don't seem to be necessarily related to what she's wearing, but he's imagining what she could be wearing in some future world. These also, it comes with, I think he begins to think about people, the body of color, the woman of color, the futuristic being, a utopian future world, which is what Afrofuturism was really about at its core. And from 1962 through the 80s, he was remained interested in this as a theme. And then eventually, with Grace Jones, he does several drawings and photographs of her as this amazing futuristic being where he creates these intense get-ups for her. She looks like she's ready to go into battle, or in some cases like the queen of some beautiful underwater world. She's wearing this fantastic shark as a hat, and she has this beautiful coral necklace that she's wearing. So again, it's kind of a fantasy, and she becomes the star of this futuristic world of possibility. And then I'll end with this, which I think is a really nice way to look at his influences and how he looked at the history of art, but how he cared about the body of color. This is, again, Angelo Colon, who he put into one of these urban warrior kinds of images. And I love how he used this cerulean blue with like a turquoise border as a halo for Angelo's head, giving him this spiritual aura. And he looks really powerful and amazing. He's got these crazy spikes coming out of the shoulder of his jacket. So he looks like he's ready for a battle, like one of the warrior saints, right? And I think he would have been inspired by something like the early Renaissance or late Byzantine Madonna that you see on the right-hand side. I think, again, it just shows the incredible talent that he had, he and Juan both, for looking for this kind of influence and incorporating it in a very modern